Are you hearing me from this? All right. Well, I appreciate being invited to come over here and talk to you a little bit about faith and science. I decided to call the lecture Archaeology, the Bible and Me. I am a professor of Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, in the Department of Religion, although since I became director of the Spurlock Museum, I have had very little time to teach, unfortunately. You missed that. But the directorship of the museum is the busiest job I've ever had, though I love it. And it has been a wonderful experience for me as well. Let me just reiterate something that Rob said, and that is that you should come over. If you haven't been to the Spurlock Museum, it's just on the east side of Kranick Center for the Performing Arts, at the corner of Gregory Street over there and Oregon. And it is a collection that's about 100 years old now. We had our centennial in 2011. And we have everything there from ancient Near East. We have ancient Mesopotamian things. We have ancient Egyptian things. We have, as you'll see, I'm going to show you a slide a little bit later of a Greek papyrus fragment that happens to be the oldest surviving fragment anywhere in the world of the letter of James from the New Testament. So we have some biblically related things that I'll talk a little bit about tonight as well. And we have North and South American cultures. We have European cultures, Asian cultures, African cultures as well. And it's really quite a remarkable collection. So as director of the museum, I'm required by law to for the museum. So now I've done that. I grew up in the Church of Christ, a conservative Christian Protestant group that has lots of weaknesses and some strengths as well. It came out of a tradition that spoke very strongly of rationalism. They reacted very strongly against Pentecostalism in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and distinguished itself from the Pentecostals. And in its early days, it supported things like new translations of the Bible in modern English and such. A lot of that kind of died away, but anyway, it was an interesting church to grow up in. One of the things that really changed me and brought me into the study of the Bible as an academic discipline was that at age 18, after I graduated from high school and when I was about to go to college, I thought to myself, I got baptized at age 12, and I've never actually read the Bible. I've gone to Sunday school and I get snippets here, snippets there, but I've never actually read straight through. So maybe I ought to do that. And so I did at 18. And I read the New Testament first. I read the book of the Gospel of Matthew. And I made that extraordinary discovery that the Bible is much better than I've ever been led to believe in church. If you actually read it as a book, you know, each one of the books as a real book and not as a group of verses and chapters, but as a full-blown book with narratives, you know, for the Gospels, so that you can actually follow how the story works its way toward a climax and has all sorts of suspense and drama in it. I just never even thought that that was part of any biblical book. So I read the New Testament and fell in love with it, and thought, well, I better read the Old Testament too. I do have to admit that that was somewhat of a bigger slog sometimes. And even though I do teach Old Testament here, I actually know better than to have students read large sections of Leviticus or Numbers in introductory courses, because it's just not going to work. But in spite of the fact that there are parts of the biblical text that do require certain specialized interests to really keep you going, I found it also to be much more dramatic and powerful than I had ever really gotten a sense of in church. I went to the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, which is where I grew up, for my undergraduate career. There was a Department of Religious Studies there. I began as a history major, but started taking so many courses in religious studies that I wound up with a double major kind of by accident. And the major that I was most interested in turned out to be the religion major. And there I got interested into the larger world of the ancient Near East that plays the context, essentially, of Israel and the development of the Bible. And one of the things that I discovered that has stayed with me all through my life is that both the Bible and the world that produced it are much more complex than you get simply by reading the Bible and not extending out beyond that. So at the University of Tennessee, I got classes on religions of the ancient Near East, where I was introduced to the religious literature of Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Canaanites, and how those religious traditions related to Israel. And that became an interest that I had that has continued. And most of my research and most of the things that I publish on actually have to do with how the cultures surrounding Israel influenced particularly the beginnings of Israelite religion. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. One of the other things that happened when I was just starting out in college was that I read C.S. Lewis for the first time. And one of the things about C.S. Lewis that surprised me a great deal was that he was not a fundamentalist. And this became very important to me, because he seemed to be a faithful Christian, and yet he could say things in books like The Problem of Pain or Reflections on the Psalms, like, it doesn't matter to me whether Adam and Eve were actual people and actually lived historically. It's what that story tells us about human nature and the relationship between God and humans that really counts. And that was something that very early in my university career, when I was beginning to see that there were these close connections between other religious traditions of the Near East, and that there were areas of the biblical books that didn't quite jive with other areas of the Bible. This really became very important to me as I began looking at the Bible more critically. In fact, I think because of C.S. Lewis, I really did begin to realize that however you interpret the notion of inspiration of Scripture, what is absolutely certain is that inspiration of Scripture is not equal to inerrancy of Scripture. And the notion that narrative materials in the Bible have to be history and have to be scientifically accurate, or else somehow God is lying to us. That kind of argument, I realized simply did not fit what I was finding concerning how the Bible actually worked. But not only that, I began to realize that the Bible itself never claims that all of its narratives have to be understood as straight history. In fact, if you pay attention, of course, you discover that there are all sorts of narratives in the biblical text that are clearly not designed to be taken as history. Most famous examples, of course, are the parables of Jesus. Those are stories that are designed and organized to make a very particular point. Most people recognize that those stories, there's no necessary connection between whether they actually happened and their validity. And so recognize that Jesus used fictional stories all the time to make his points. And in fact, fiction is often the best means to convey a point. And that's why most of the greatest literature from the ancient world is fiction. We feel much closer to the Iliad and the Odyssey, to the great plays of the Greek tragedians, to the works of Shakespeare, to the works of Charles Dickens, than we do to Herodotus, the father of history, Thucydides, the great historian of the Peloponnesian War in Greece, or Xenophon. Those are of interest, particularly to historians, but they don't tell you the truth the way the fictional materials do. Another great example, of course, is Aesop's Fables. Wonderful, wonderful stories. Nobody would mistake them for history, but they tell you everything you need to know about human nature in many ways. Okay? So once I realized that we don't have to really worry about the issue of forcing the biblical narratives into a historical framework all the time. Doesn't mean there isn't history there. There is history there. But we don't have to force our everything into a historical mold, and therefore we're free to actually take the biblical text at its own requirements, rather than force our requirements on the biblical text. And once I felt free about that, then spending time trying to understand how Israel came to understand its relationship with God, how it came to understand who its God was, and how, in fact, you can actually follow a long, centuries long development of their understanding who God is, so that you can understand that the religion of the ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as it sort of peeks through the stories in Genesis, that's quite different from the religion of Moses, which is quite different from the religion of Solomon, which is quite different from the religion of Isaiah, which is quite different from the religion of Jeremiah, which is quite different from the religion of Ezra and Nehemiah. The fact is that religious ideas grow and change. If they stayed the same, they would die. And our religious traditions today are quite different. I think if you compared Lutheran theology of today to Lutheran theology of Martin Luther's time, you see that there has been quite a bit of growth over these past 500 years as well. And that's good, because that's what humans do. They grow and they change, and theologies grow and change, and ways of telling stories grow and change, and such. Okay? So that is sort of my background in how I wound up then at Harvard University in their Ancient Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations department. and focusing on biblical Hebrew and Hebrew Bible itself, and archaeology of Syria-Palestine, and the language of the ancient Mesopotamians, the Akkadian language. Those are sort of my 4 areas of focus at Harvard. Turned out to be a very good place to study and a very good place to be, and almost by accident I wound up getting a 2-year visiting appointment here at the University of Illinois in 1983, and after 2 years they liked me well enough to appoint me as a tenure-track professor here, and so I've been here ever since, and it's been a very nice place. One thing I knew from the very beginning of being really, really interested in the Bible was that I did not want to be a minister. I wanted to study the Bible, but I knew that I didn't want to, I did not have the temperament to do all the myriad things that a minister does. So I sort of got the best of all worlds here, in that I can study the Bible, but I don't get phone calls at 2 o'clock in the morning. So that has worked out well. I also knew that coming out of a conservative church that I would never get a job at a Church of Christ university, and so I never even tried. And having been to a state university as an undergraduate, I really liked the way that state universities work, so I felt really lucky that I got this offer here at the University of Illinois. So let me talk a little bit about how I teach Bible at a state institution. We are one of the few parts of the university that actually does have some reference in the Constitution of the United States. Most scientists don't have to deal with the issue of church and state, but we actually do have to think about that in the way that we teach things. And so I have always felt strongly that it is not my purpose in class to try to convert people. I also don't try to unconvert people. I talk about some of the issues that I've already just sort of raised very briefly here, and indicated to students that are concerned when they start hearing me talk about some of the narratives of the Bible not being historical and such. I do talk to them in more detail about how the Bible itself never actually says that that's the way you have to understand these stories, and that in fact that frees you up to understand these stories in different ways, and often to not have to worry then about the conflicts between science and history and the biblical text, of which there are many. You don't have to worry about that anymore if you realize that that does not damage the message of the Bible at all for the Bible to have these ideas about science and ideas about history that are part of their day and time, and have been later shown to be not exactly true from a scientific point of view. Truth, like I said, is not something that is to be equated with history or with science. Truth comes out of all sorts of different types of literatures. Okay. So, what do I do in the class? Well, I tend to focus on the story of the development of Israel's religion from the earliest times when Israel's first emerging as a state, down in my introduction to the Old Testament, down to the 2nd century BC, when I end up with talking about the book of Daniel. So what I want them to understand is how you can, by looking at the Bible, see how the ideas that we sort of take for granted from the Hebrew Bible actually, were not necessarily there at the very beginning, and you can actually watch people arguing for these new ideas as time goes on. And in fact, it becomes a very thrilling thing to see how different people bring in new ideas and argue for them at critical moments in the development of Israel. So I do sort of a history of the religion as an important part of what I talk about. And I also talk about the cultural context out of which Israel and the Bible itself emerged. As I've said, I really do find it fascinating to look at the Canaanite culture, which is the culture out of which Israel emerged. The Canaanites are seen in the stories as the people who are in the land that becomes the land of Israel. And that's very much the case. What has turned out to be clear from archaeological discoveries is that in spite of the fact that the Bible and the Israelites themselves really worked very hard to distinguish themselves from the Canaanites, and they essentially said, we're related to the Ammonites and Moabites and the Edomites and the Arameans, but we have absolutely no relationship to the Canaanites. But with the discovery of the one surviving library of ancient Canaanite religious texts found at a city in northern Syria called Ugarit back in the 1920s and 30s, what has become clear, in fact, is that the religion of Israel is more closely related to the religion of the Canaanites than to any other religious tradition anywhere around. And culturally speaking, the Israelites are very, very similar to the Canaanites. Hebrew itself is a Canaanite dialect. The language, Hebrew, is a Canaanite dialect. It's very closely related to the dialect of this Canaanite library, but it goes way beyond that. It turns out in this Canaanite library that we discovered things that nobody had ever guessed before. Everybody thought that there was Israel's God, and then there was Baal, who was the king of the Canaanite gods and the rival to Israel's God. These texts actually deal with Baal quite extensively. They actually tell you how he became the head of the divine council. But the big surprise in these texts is that it turns out that Baal is not the king of the gods. He's actually second in command. He actually becomes the co-regent, the younger co-regent, with another god who is the great god, the God who created the world and who grants children to people to continue their family line and such, who's called the kind, the compassionate God, the father of Adam, father of Adam, the father of humanity. The word Adam means humanity. And more surprisingly was what this God's name was. It turns out this God's name is El, E-L. And why that's significant is because in Genesis and early parts of Exodus, the biblical text tells us that the God of the ancestors, the God worshipped by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was actually named El. In Exodus 6, verses 2 and 3, Yahweh, the new name of God that he reveals to Moses, Yahweh says, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, El, the one of the mountain. But by my name Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. So in Exodus 6, it explicitly says that the ancestors did not know the name Yahweh. They worshiped God under the name of El. And that's the name of the king of the Canaanite gods in the tablets, the Canaanite tablets from Pitard. And when you look at the stories that we have from the Canaanite library, it turns out that El is doing exactly the kinds of things that he's doing in the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There is one epic from the library about a very righteous old man by the name of Daniel, but without the yeah in the middle, so Daniel, who is too old. He and his wife are too old to have children anymore, but they never had a son, and they really wanted a son. And so they pray to their patron god, who is Baal. Turns out Baal cannot grant children to humans. He's the fertility god for plants and animals. So he goes to El and asks El to do something for Don El and his wife Donatia. And El decides to grant them a child in their old age. So he reinvigorates Donatia, and she becomes pregnant, and they have a son in their old age. Now, have you ever heard of a story like that? It's just, it's really quite fascinating. What El does in these stories in the Canaanite library is what he does in the stories of the ancestors in Genesis. When it comes to very early Israel, with Yahweh, what do they do when Yahweh becomes their national deity at Mount Sinai? They build him not a permanent shrine, they build him a tent shrine, right? The tabernacle. Interestingly enough, El, in the Canaanite material, does not live in a palace like all the other gods do. He lives in a tent. So there are just all these things that indicate that the Canaanite El is essentially the God who is basically Israel's God. And so we actually sort of have a prehistory of Israel. Before Israel comes into existence, we now are able to pick up clues from the biblical text itself. There's a place in Genesis 33 where Jacob buys some land near Shechem, builds an altar, and he names the altar El Elohei Yisrael, which means El is the God of Israel. Okay? So the Bible itself was giving all these hints about this in Exodus 6 verses 2 and 3 that explicitly says, the ancestors knew me by the name El. Nobody really understood that until we began to understand that there was a deity, El, that was the ancient deity, and certain parts of the text in Exodus are absolutely right that the name Yahweh does not appear until the time of Moses. And so it's preserving for us some traditions that we had no idea how it worked until we got these Canaanite texts. And now we can sort of add a new layer of our understanding that the Israelites didn't just sort of pop out of nowhere with a completely new concept of God. But in fact, they are coming out of the tradition that they actually have been part of for all of previous time. And the new stuff is simply by taking what is there and thinking about it and realizing new things about God. Okay? So that's the kind of thing that I find really enjoyable and exciting to work on. So that's what I've done a lot of my work on. You cannot do a talk on archaeology in the Bible without showing some pictures. So what I wanted to do now is run through a little bit of the kinds of things that I do deal with when I'm talking about archaeology and the Bible, and how they can be used both to have greater understanding of the general culture, but also the specific culture. So let me run through a few quick slides here, and let's see how far we actually can get. I always talk about how the Bible is the single most influential book of Western civilization and probably the world, because it did revolutionize the religious understandings of first the peoples of Europe, and then in more recent centuries all across the world. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all trace their origins to the religion of ancient Israel as depicted in the Bible. And so, along with Greece and Rome, Israelite civilization is in fact one of the foundational cultures of Western Civ. The Bible itself, though, is quite complicated, as I've mentioned. It's an anthology of writings produced over a period of 1,000 years. Starting out, there are some older pieces than 950 BCE, but the first big works that we still have preserved come from 950 BCE to 100 CE for the last stuff in the New Testament. Wide range of literary genres in the biblical text, and that's one of the things that once you understand that you're dealing with lots of different kinds of literature, then you don't get hung up on whether a person could actually survive inside the belly of a big fish, you know, in Jonah, and you can actually focus on the whole point of the book of Jonah, which really has to do with tolerance. And it's a remarkable story that often gets swallowed up by the whale. It's also important to understand that most of the writings underwent revision and re-editing over the centuries. They weren't written down once and copyrighted and not changed at all from that time. These books came to have new meanings as time went on, and people added stories and revised stories to make them more meaningful to people at a later time. And so that actually is a really important thing to be aware of. The cultures reflected in the Bible, ancient Israel and the Greco-Roman world of early Christianity, also underwent dramatic changes over those centuries. And you know, they weren't Americans dressed in togas. You know, they really were different cultures, and we have to be aware of the fact that they are thinking about things differently. Okay. Okay. So, what does archaeology do? Archaeology studies the material remains of extinct civilizations, tries to order that material, interpret it, and if there is history connected, writing connected to it, the archaeologist tries to place the two together if possible. What can archaeology do? Well, it can reveal the civilizations out of which Israel emerged. I'll give you a hint of just how interesting that can be. It illuminates the living conditions of the ancient Israelites. That's a wonderful thing as well. We really know what life was like. It sometimes can clear up enigmatic passages from the Bible. Does that fairly often, actually. Can indicate sometimes when a narrative should be understood as historical, and sometimes when it should not be understood as historical. And sometimes it actually can illuminate specific events reported in the Bible. But that doesn't happen very often, because most archaeological remains are too general to actually be focused on a single thing. Okay? The important thing to understand about archaeology is what it cannot do, and that is that it cannot prove that the Bible is either true or false with a capital T or a capital F in a theological sense. It can tell you that the Bible is much more complicated than the older 19th century idea that everything was history. But it cannot tell you that the Bible is true. That's a theological thing. That's a matter of faith. And you can study the Bible with or without that faith. So let me just show you a few pictures. When you go to the when you go to the Middle East and you want to go see an ancient city, most of the time people will go, your tour guide will take you out to an area where there's a rather artificial looking hill like this and say, that was the great city of Megiddo. You look at it and you say, looks like a hill to me. And, but in fact these are where cities used to be. The reason that they are so artificially sloped and such has to do with the fact that city walls were built around these towns, and they sort of keep the town intact as it's built and rebuilt and rebuilt and reoccupied and destroyed over centuries. Here is a site. They're called tells in the Middle East. You can see this one right here. One thing that's interesting about this one, oh, I guess it didn't, is that there's a suburb out here. So this is Tel Karkur right here. This is Tel Savoy. Oh, there it is. Yeah. So there's Tel Savoy, right there, close to the big town. Ancient cities were tiny compared to modern cities. Most ancient cities would fit into the area flanked by Wright Street, Matthews, Gregory, and Green. That's an area of about 40 acres, as I have argued, as I have sort of tried to figure it out. And most sites in ancient Israel were less than 40 acres, enclosed within city walls. So you wonder what a city like this might have looked like when it was alive. Well, there are actually a few living cities on top of tells yet today. Here's a beautiful example called Al-Mudik in Syria, where, as you can see, on top of it, there's a city wall. It's a medieval city wall, still going around it. I do have to say that, unfortunately, Al-Mudik has been caught up in the rebellion in Syria and has been seriously damaged. But you can see what any of these ancient cities looked like when they were still occupied. Here's another example. The citadel at Aleppo, also badly damaged in the fighting that's going on, unfortunately. Medieval fortress on top there. Okay. Just a little bit about excavating. It is a dirty business. This is my wife here in the white hat. She sort of became my model the first time we were on an excavation. And it is a frustrating business of trying to keep all the dirt, clean up all the dirt before photographs are taken. Have you ever tried to clean dirt? It's not an easy thing. And that's what they're having to do there. But and you work in squares so that you can look at the sides of the squares and you can actually see the levels that you have gone down through. So you can see here, for example, they've cut through a pit that was lined with plaster, later filled in so that a new floor could be built on top of it, things like that. When you've done all the cleaning, you get a picture like this, where you can see every stone nice and clearly in every place. And so that's a bit of what excavation is like. So what do you have from ancient times? What kind of archaeological things can you look at? Well, from the Roman period, you get really nice ruins like this at Palmyra in Syria. These are actually the walls of a palace at Ebla from about 2300 BC. A remarkably well-preserved palace there. This is what an Israelite home generally looks like. It is basically the foundation walls made of stone that you see surviving till today. So they don't look beautiful, but if you can sort of imagine how they were built, then you can get a sense of life in ancient Israel. There are tombs that you find. There is pottery that you find, sometimes like this, set up in the corner. When the house was destroyed by King Sennacherib, this is from Gezer in Israel. This was destroyed by King Sennacherib of Assyria at the time that he besieged the city of Jerusalem in 701 BC. You can find the remains of ovens. Occasionally you can find gold. This is a beautiful gold bowl from Ugarit in Syria. Sometimes you find things as boring looking as flint tools. You also find writing. This is a broken piece of pottery. It was used as a writing source to write a letter. You sometimes have seals, carved seals. This one is actually a seal of Jehoahaz, son of the king, probably son of the king who became king of Judah. You can find inscribed clay tablets. This one is from the Spurlock. Just to give you an example of what a clay tablet looks like, all those impressions into the clay look like chicken scratches, are actually script, Mesopotamian script. Here is one of the tablets from Ugarit, one of the Canaanite tablets. This is the first tablet of the Kirta epic, an epic that has really interesting connections with the book of Job, and is really fascinating. Dead Sea Scrolls. And sometimes you find people. I want you to sort of take a look at this picture here. This is a couple, a man and a woman found at Hasarlu in western Iran from about 800 BC, when the town was overrun by the Urartians, a particularly nasty group of invaders who took no prisoners. And apparently they knew that the Urartians took no prisoners. So rather than going out into the street where skeletons were found of people who've been mowed down in the streets, they stayed in their home and they lay down, and we don't know how they did it, but they died together. And so you've got the male is here, the female is here, she's lying on his shoulder. They are looking at each other, and if you look carefully, she has her hand on his cheek. 2,800 years ago. And we can look at this pair of skeletons and we can be reminded that those ancient people had a lot of similarities to us. They were essentially us. They are not running around in a fantasy land. You know, they are real people with real issues and such. And here's a love story. A love story that we get just this hint of from these two skeletons. But you can look at those two and you can say, they loved each other. Almost 3,000 years ago. And so one of the things I like to remind people is we look at a lot of walls and buildings and columns and pots and things like that. All these things were made for people and by people, and those people were a lot like us. Okay? Well, I think I better stop, and but that gives you a sense of some of the kinds of things that we do. Any questions?
As a scholar, sir, as a scholar, how would you epitomize the revolution that means a nascent monotheism?
Monotheism, that's a particularly powerful point. And one of those that actually is also very complicated in the Bible. because there are lots of indications that monotheism really didn't become the primary Israelite idea until the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in the 6th century. We're so used to thinking of the prophets as the holders on to tradition, and the people who are worshiping all those other gods as having fallen away. But what you got to understand is that the people who are worshiping other gods in Judah are the establishment. It's the people it's the priesthood in Jerusalem that has not only the temple of Yahweh, but has places to worship other gods in the temple compound itself, and there are temples outside of the temple compound that have been found by archaeologists. And they are the establishment. The prophets are the anti-establishment. They are the outsiders. And they are arguing for something that is revolutionary. And it is not actually until the destruction of Jerusalem in which the people in charge in Jerusalem actually decided that Jerusalem could not be captured, and that God would never allow the city to be destroyed. They were proved wrong, and people like Jeremiah, who were not only on the outside, but who were in constant danger of being killed for his controversial views, he turned out to be right. When he said, if you don't change, God's going to allow the city to be destroyed and the temple to be demolished. And that's exactly what happened. And as a result of that, the people in exile, the priesthood in exile, said, well, maybe we ought to look back at what those guys had said. And they actually, that the people who were the outsiders before the destruction of Jerusalem become the winners in the long run. But it really didn't happen until the 6th century. And so, people wondered, for example, why it is that the goddess Asherah seems to be the most popular goddess in Israel. The prophets talk about worshiping the Asherah poles and things like that all the time. Well, we now know why Asherah was the most popular goddess in Israel. That's because in the Canaanite text from Ugarit, guess who Asherah is? Asherah is Aal's wife. And so if Yahweh is Asherah, if Yahweh is, Aal is Yahweh, then Aal's wife is Yahweh's wife. And so for a very long time, Asherah is worshipped right alongside of Yahweh. And it's only as actual monotheism says you can't have two, you can only have one. Yahweh, of course, as the patriarchal side of this, wins out. So, actually following the development and the arguments about worshiping of Yahweh alone is very, very exciting and quite a remarkable thing to follow. And it's much more exciting if you understand that that's not a given. As Israel is developing, it's not a given. And in fact, even within the establishment, that's a very small minority view for a long time. Yes?
You mentioned that occasionally the archaeological record can clarify a very enigmatic passage. Would you like to give an example?
Sure. There's some very simple examples, like the fact that the Bible has mentions a whole series of weights and measures, and we didn't know what those weights and measures actually were. The whole tradition of those were lost. But now excavators find little carefully carved round balls, and written on them are the measure that it is. And so a pim weight is, you find pim weights all around Israel, and you actually weigh them, and they essentially weigh the same. we've got those kinds of things. The discovery of the tablets, the Canaanite tablets from Ugarit. It has the vocabulary is very similar to Hebrew. And there are lots of words in the Hebrew text that we don't know what they mean. Tradition has lost what they mean. They're only used once or twice in the whole Bible. And all of a sudden, you have 3 or 4 examples of its use in new contexts in the Canaanite literature. And suddenly, we have a better sense of what it probably means in Hebrew as well. So there are things like that. We had a fairly unclear view of exactly what goes on when King Sennacherib comes down and besieges Jerusalem. But now we know a lot more about that siege, because it just so happens that in Mesopotamia, King Sennacherib wrote a lot about his side of how that all worked. And so we have his account of the siege of Jerusalem. We have the biblical account of the siege of Jerusalem. We have the, not only did he write about it, but Sennacherib actually did a depiction of the capture of the city of Lachish, which was the second city of Judah. And we know, although it's only just sort of mentions very much on the side, that Sennacherib was at Lachish. It doesn't talk about the fall of Lachish, it says he was there. Now we know about the capture of Lachish because he actually did a relief carving showing the capture of Lachish. And we have the archaeological work that's actually been done at Lachish, where they actually discovered the siege ramp that the Assyrians built. It's one of the few